So first, I know Dr. Stewart did an awesome job of introduction, but this is just some background about me. I got my bachelor's degree from Louisiana State University in nutritional sciences, master's degree from Lipscomb University in exercise and nutrition science. Lipscomb is in Nashville, Tennessee. I'm a certified diabetes educator, and I officially joined the team at the Center for Sport at the beginning of this year. However, I have been working with the professional athlete care team for over a year and a half now, since I've been coming downtown to the clinic. All right, as far as disclosures go, I have nothing to disclose. I have no actual or potential conflict of interest with this program or presentation. So, as far as objectives for this presentation, we're going to describe the importance of energy balance during the recovery process from injury. We're going to identify the recommended protein intake during injury recovery. We're going to identify the best dietary protein sources during injury recovery, and then also list some other nutrients that potentially could aid in recovery from a sports injury. All right. Okay. So here's a list of common injuries for a variety of sports. The type and severity of the injury will impact muscle loss, especially if immobilization is required. From some of the research I looked at, knee injuries appear to be the most serious and generally require the most recovery time. And according to the research, 1/3 of injuries occur in contact sports, while occur in non-contact sports. So I thought that was pretty interesting. All right. As far as the injury process, in general, with exercise-induced injuries, they have basically two main stages. In stage 1, you have the initial inflammatory response and that wound healing process. During this stage, there's reduced activity, which can make nutrition an even more important issue, which we'll talk about. And then in stage 2, you have that reintroduction of activity and the rehab process. However, in both stages, you could have a period of immobilization dependent upon the injury and its severity. Nutrition intervention can be beneficial for reducing the negative impact of injury and also supporting the increase in activity during rehab. So nutrition is going to be very important. So breaking down those two stages a little bit more in detail, would be stage 1. So in stage 1, we initially have that inflammation as that first initial step. Research points out that in healthy athletic populations, there's really not a strong amount of evidence there to recommend specific nutrients like an omega-3 or vitamins and other nutrients at this point in time. This could impede the process and could be counterproductive. We also don't have enough evidence to recommend specific nutrients or know the duration and the dosage to optimally reduce inflammation. So this particularly pertains to acute inflammation from an injury. This is different than, say, chronic inflammation from a chronic disease, say like rheumatoid arthritis. There might be some specific benefit to using like an omega-3 or turmeric or something else that might help lessen that inflammation. But in terms of acute injuries, there doesn't appear to be a benefit there at this point in time based on the research. Most importantly, during this inflammation stage and wound healing process, there's increased energy requirements. So making sure we're taking enough calories is very important in the short term. And then evidence showing protein, we have evidence that shows protein and energy malnutrition can exacerbate that inflammatory response and slow the wound healing or delay wound healing. So underconsumption of calories is something that we want to avoid. Step 2 would be proliferation. And basically here, this is, putting this in there, this is an energy requiring process requiring some additional
Can anyone hear me? Okay, I'm trying to get Mike.
Hey,
Okay,
right.
good.
It appears my internet dropped out or something there.
All right, you want to go
So
ahead and
let's go back to the PowerPoint there. All right, so stage 2, this is where I left off. Is this okay? Is this where we were?
can you go back one slide? Or is this the slide?
Go back one.
Go back one, I think.
All right.
Yeah.
All right, so here we go. Okay, so let's go through this one more time. The stage 1 of the injury process, broken down to a 3-step process. We have that initial inflammation stage or part of the stage, and this is that initial step. The research points out that actually in healthy athletic populations, there's not really strong evidence to recommend specific nutrients, specific supplementation of anything like an omega-3 or specific vitamin or other nutrient at this time. They actually state that this could actually impede the process and be a little bit counterproductive at this point. So we don't have enough evidence to recommend specific nutrients or actually have any type of research to look at the duration or the dosage needed to optimally reduce inflammation in an acute injury like this. Long-term though, or not long-term, but for chronic diseases like that have chronic inflammation, we might see a benefit in terms of using like an omega-3 or something else to help lessen that inflammation. But in terms of exercise-induced injuries, doesn't appear to be important at this time or be useful. Step 2 or part 2 of this stage, you have the proliferation process, and more energy is required during this time where you need more calories to help with wound healing and that natural progression of the injury to occur. And then finally, remodeling where scar tissue is broken down and replaced. This is an energy requiring process as well. So consuming enough calories is the main point here, not under consuming. And the majority of evidence in this presentation and in terms of research for nutrition nutrition for injury focuses on stage 1 of the injury process. So if you look at stage 2, this is that rehab and return activity stage. And this time period can vary quite a bit depending upon the injury and the severity. But returning to full activity and competition can take much longer if immobilization is required. The nutrition recommendations in this stage are similar for those focusing on muscle growth, which will generally involve increasing protein in the diet. And we'll talk a lot more about protein. Okay, so let's talk about the consequences of injury and what's going on. So physiological consequences, you're looking at number 1, muscle atrophy. Okay, so this is going to be where the major area of nutrition intervention can have an impact on reducing how much muscle is lost. Okay, we know nutrition can be a big help there. Number 2, muscular strength is decreased as well. So research shows that strength reduction can be at 3 times the rate at which muscle tissue is lost. So big reduction there. And then finally, potential limb immobilization. So, injuries that would potentially require this would be like a muscle tear or strain, a broken limb, dislocation, torn ligament. This is the area where the majority of research looks at in terms of nutrition providing improvement. So we'll talk about injury and, if injuries require a brace or cast, what can affect the associated muscle groups and what can be done from a dietary perspective to help improve outcomes. All right, so first let's dig into muscle loss a little bit. So depending upon the location and the severity of the injury, how much muscle loss will be different. If it's a knee injury or an athlete breaks a leg, that's where you might see a large amount of muscle tissue lost because of the athlete not being able to put any weight on that limb. The nutrition research in this area tries to simulate situation of injury by putting subjects in a leg or arm cast or a knee brace. And what's surprising when you look at the research is that the rate at which muscle loss occurs. So within just days of an injury, we see measurable amounts of lean tissue that is lost. So 2 articles that I was looking at and I reviewed were in agreement that the rate is somewhere about 0.5% loss of lean tissue per day while immobilized. And so this translates to about 150 grams of lean tissue that is lost each day and about 1 kilogram or 2.2 pounds lost in a single week. So it's a significant amount. The rate of which how much tissue is lost can be affected by the muscle group, the age of the person, the gender, and the training status of the athlete. So if we can preserve muscle during this early period, perhaps we can recover from injury faster, okay? As mentioned in the previous slide, strength declines as well. And so looking at that research, it's somewhere in a range of 0.3 to 4.2% per day with injury. And so a study by Wall and colleagues looked at and showed that an 8% muscle loss in quadricep muscle and a 23% decline after just 2 weeks of immobilization. So big decrease in a short period of time. Another point to keep in mind here, not just muscle, but bone health can also be affected by disuse. So not putting any weight or a leg or on a leg or ankle can also result in some problems where you have less bone density because of calcium being released. And so this indicates a need to focus on foods that are rich in calcium, vitamin D, vitamin K to include within the diet to help preserve bone health. Also, if a person is on bed rest, lower back muscles and leg muscle groups are going to be the most susceptible to muscle atrophy. So somebody has a major surgery, that's where you're going to see those muscle groups affected. So let's talk about why this muscle loss is happening. So why are we losing muscle loss and strength? So normally in healthy weight stable people, muscle mass remains constant due to this balance of protein synthesis and protein breakdown. So the body is constantly breaking down protein and synthesizing it. In skeletal muscle, that's about a turnover rate of 1 to 2% per day. So theoretically, it takes a few months, 3 to 4 months for complete turnover of all skeletal muscle in the body. When we have muscle protein balance, there's an equal amount of muscle protein being synthesized and muscle protein broken down. So that's why we have results that equal a maintenance of muscle mass. However, if we tip that scale one way or the other, we're going to have some changes. So when muscle loss occurs, we have something called negative muscle protein balance. And this is basically more protein is being broken down or is greater than how much muscle protein is being synthesized. And this is what happens during injury when a muscle is no longer being used, resulting in atrophy. So the evidence points to this muscle protein breakdown as being one of the major points in terms of decreasing muscle protein synthesis and being a major contributor to muscle loss. This has more of an influence actually on muscle loss than muscle protein breakdown. So that decrease in muscle protein synthesis is what's really happening and having a huge effect. On the opposite end, when you're trying to increase, right, we're trying to build new muscle, lean body tissue, we have a positive balance, and so we're synthesizing more than we're breaking down, okay? And so we'll discuss ways to increase muscle protein synthesis throughout the presentation here. All right, so in addition to that muscle protein balance, imbalance happening, we also have something called anabolic resistance occurring. So this is the other major contributor to muscle loss from an injury that happens. So what happens is during a period of injury or rest or disuse, muscle starts to become resistant, and it has a decreased ability for protein or amino acids, which are the building blocks of protein, to stimulate new muscle to be built. So what that means is when we're consuming foods rich in protein, that protein is not being utilized effectively like it was when that muscle was active and contracting and working, okay? So research is showing that inactivity of just 14 days can really increase this anabolic resistance. So just a 2-week time frame, we start to see an increase of this anabolic resistance. So this emphasizes during that recovery process, it's best if we can prevent long-term immobilization and get that muscle working to allow for muscle protein synthesis to occur to prevent large losses. This will also help definitely what we're talking about here in terms of preventing anabolic resistance. And nutrition can be a big, important component here for this anabolic resistance as well, which we'll talk about. Anabolic resistance also affects tendon and collagen synthesis as well. So not just affecting the muscle, but other tissues as well. All right. So what can we do from a nutrition standpoint? I've kind of described some processes. What can we do from a nutrition standpoint to help improve this injury recovery? So we want to improve wound healing. We want less muscle loss. We want faster recovery and time to competing again. First, we'll talk about calorie needs, energy needs, and what adjustments might need to be made there. Second, we'll look at protein and the recommendations needed there. And then we'll look at some other additional nutrients that might be beneficial in terms of injury recovery. First, let's talk about energy and calorie requirements, okay? So let's talk about these recommendations in regards for injury recovery. And the main goal here is preventing that muscle loss, okay? So first here, just kind of some general numbers when you're looking at caloric requirements. We have different ways of calculating this. These can vary quite a bit for various reasons, including gender, body composition, the sport being played, the position, in season, off season, and the goals. So you could have a smaller athlete off season, or not doing a whole lot of work currently, that could only require, say, 2,000 calories per day, versus saying an in-season male basketball player that could be requiring 5,000 calories per day. And so we have multiple ways of estimating calorie needs as dietitians. So without any tools or machines, we can use equations that help calculate basal metabolic rate. And then we can factor in additional calories for the activity or competition. That's one way to estimate. And then there are also some devices that could be used as well if you have them. But in general, for what I'm using, it's mostly using an equation like the Mifflin-St. Jean or Cunningham equation, which takes into account lean body mass to estimate somebody's calorie needs. Injured athletes, though, especially initially, they might inadvertently decrease their energy intake through that initial phase. However, early in the recovery process, like we're saying, we have an increased need for calories and can go up to 20% or even as high as 50%, depending upon if somebody has surgery or how major that injury is. So we definitely don't want to see a energy deficit in that initial phase of injury recovery. If not enough calories are supplied, that recovery is going to be slowed, wound healing is going to take a lot longer, and there's going to be a faster rate of muscle loss, which is what we do not want. So avoiding underconsumption of calories is really key to preventing that loss of muscle. If we underconsume calories, not only we're creating an energy deficit there, but we're also likely underconsuming the amount of protein we're taking in, because we're not taking in enough calories. And so research shows this can be very detrimental for muscle protein synthesis to occur in a muscular adult male. That takes 500 calories per day. So if we're not taking in enough energy, we're not going to be able to stimulate that muscle protein synthesis. So we definitely want to make sure calories are being supplied. So what about on the opposite end, if we're providing extra calories? Say we want to kind of go safe here and say, well, just consume more than your estimated needs, or a lot more than what we're estimating here. Well, that might be detrimental too, according to some of the research. So some of the research that I found specifically in the subject looked at excess calories, and that could potentially accelerate muscle loss via systemic inflammation, interestingly enough. So providing too many calories and potentially increasing body fat could be detrimental as well. But in terms of the major point here, the key for faster recovery is supplying enough calories for the injury based on the needs of that individual. So we don't have weight loss, we don't have weight gain. So practically monitoring weight is a way to gauge this. It's also recommended, if possible, exercise not involving the injury to happen. So if we can encourage that as much as possible, if that's okay, the research says that will be beneficial in terms of speeding up the recovery. Okay, so calories, very important. Next thing, very important, protein, all right? So as mentioned, if energy intake drops, likely protein will drop as well. Not always, but likely that can happen, okay? So if you're not taking enough calories, then you're likely not taking in enough protein, especially if the diet's not planned properly. So plenty of research to show that sudden decreases in protein intake, especially like say for athletes who are already consuming a little bit more protein or should be consuming a little bit more protein, if they have a sudden decrease there, they're going to see a sharp decrease in muscle loss if they cut back on how much protein's in their diet. So we'll look at more specifics in terms of protein amounts on the next slide, but an increase likely is going to be recommended for most folks going through injury. Without adequate protein, that muscle metabolism, like we talked about, is going to be affected. And then specifically, looking at research, there's a study comparing athletes who consume protein at two different levels, one at 2.3 grams per kilogram and one at just 1 gram per kilogram of body weight. And we'll go into a little bit more details, kind of show you what that looks like. But when those athletes cut back on their calories, the group that had that intake of protein had much muscle loss compared to that lower protein group. Okay. Into energy restriction, we still want to make sure they're consuming adequate or higher amounts of protein to preserve that muscle. All right. So calories and protein. Now, how much protein? All right. So this is a nice little chart, relatively new, that developed the International Protein Board, who's basically a group of researchers that solely focus on protein research. Okay. So this graph, the graphic is current with the current research describing how much protein is needed for various groups. So in the left-hand column, you can see, depending upon where you fall, right, how much protein per kilogram is needed. And then on the right, it kind of explains in those bullet points, what's the reasons there, okay? So at the top, you have something called the recommended dietary allowance, all right? And so currently, here, the current RDA for protein is 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight. So that's the minimum recommendation to prevent any type of deficiency. It's not an optimal intake of protein. And a lot of the research, especially from this group, is showing that that actually needs to be increased. They have basically showing that for general health, upping it to at least 1.1 grams per kilogram of body weight, okay? So you can see if you go down to, at the bottom, sport performance building, and that's kind of where I want to focus, because that's really where the recommendations are going to fall in line in terms of injury recovery as well. All right. So here at the bottom, you can see it says 1.8 to 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight. So the research that I looked at evaluating how much protein is needed for recovery is basically in that range, 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram, up to 2 to 2.5 grams per kilogram. So a much higher protein for just the general average individual, even just normal exerciser, looking for much higher protein intakes for injury recovery. So based on that research, I would personally probably recommend closer to that higher end, to the 2 gram per kilogram of body weight, in terms of how much protein to take. And so this would be important for stage 1, but also stage 2 of recovery when we're focusing on just muscle building and muscle hypertrophy. Well, what does that look like in terms of calculating? All right. So this is just an example to kind of show you guys what that looks like practically. So say you have a football player who weighs 250 pounds. To get his weight, grams divided by 2.2, we got 114. So we multiply that by 2 grams per kilogram, and 228 grams per day. So if we're ideally planning out a diet for this person, consuming 228 grams of protein spread out the day would be a start. Okay. Just another example, say we have a smaller 165 pounds, converting that into kilograms, we're looking at about 150 grams per day of protein. And in general, if your position stands for nutritionics, in general, the range for endurance to strength training athletes is generally in the range of 1.7 kilograms. So going up to is a little bit higher, but not necessarily a huge jump, unless they're already under consuming protein. Then it could be to consume enough in the day. Okay. So what about, how much protein to consume in a meal versus just, trying to, how many meals should we be eating every day to consume adequate for injury recovery? Well, protein specifically is made up of acids, and certain those amino acids are going to help stimulate that muscle protein synthesis. So after we eat a meal and we digest it, we have this anabolic response that occurs that starts to stimulate that muscle building process to happen. Okay. And that muscle protein synthesis after a meal can last up to about 5 hours or so, according to the research. So protein intake provides that amino acids needed for that muscle protein synthesis to occur. If we don't have protein in the diet, we're not going to be able to stimulate that muscle protein synthesis from happening. Okay. Well, how much is needed to stimulate there? Okay. Well, we've got research stating some differences. Some state about 35 to 40 grams of protein in a meal to maximally it. One paper I found for it was in healthy young males stated 20 grams per meal. Another stated 30 grams. So it appears it's likely somewhere between 20 to 40 grams in a meal, ideally in terms of maximizing that muscle protein synthesis to occur. Okay. As far as spreading it out, we have a lot of research on muscle building and muscle hypertrophy, and there's a new meta-analysis that came out last year, 2019, that has a nice recommendation in terms of how much you need to amongst meals to maximally stimulate muscle. And the conclusion there was 0.4 grams per kilogram per meal in at least 4 meals. So this makes sense. If we go back to the slide that has the protein recommendations, if we do the 0.4 grams at a minimum for 4 meals, that's going to get you to just about that 1.8. It's technically about 1.6. But based on the research, the 1.6 is that bare minimum to get you to how much protein you need every single day. So if you do 4 meals, 0.4 grams per kilogram, you're at least getting 1.6 grams a kilogram in the entire day for protein. If you go up to 2 grams, like I was recommending, you're going to get, it's going to be somewhere about 0.5 or 0.55 grams per kilogram through. So it's going to be a little bit higher. If we look at that, the athlete example that I had, the football player, this is going to equate to about 45 grams of protein per meal, at least 4 meals per day. And so making sure they're consuming the right foods to get that amount of protein is going to be super, super important. Okay. In general, though, for athletes, we're always trying to recommend more frequent eating to supply the calories, the nutrients that they need, at least 5 or 6 meals per day, because if they're not eating enough, they're not going to be taking in enough nutrients that their body needs. So if they could, as much as they can, try to stick to that same schedule, this will also help throughout this whole injury recovery process. We want to avoid skipping meals, just doing 2 meals per day, even if they might be 80 grams of protein in a meal, because we're not going to be able to utilize all that protein in that meal, spreading it out into a little bit smaller quantities. Okay, very important. Regarding the specific types though, of protein, amino acids are the building blocks. And so we have essential amino acids that are basically what's needed here for that muscle protein synthesis to occur. And so leucine is really, really important. And it's also called a branch chain amino acid, okay? The internet connection is unstable. So hopefully you guys hopefully I don't get disconnected here. Leucine is very important, shown to be what's called an anabolic trigger. So it helps stimulate muscle protein synthesis to occur. So I'll show you a little bit more about leucine-rich foods and their quantities on the next slide. Supplementation can be something somebody might go for at this point, because we have lots of advertisement and we have things in terms of muscle building, especially for physique athletes or general. BCAAs are a popular supplement, so branch chain amino acids. These are popular and advertised for building more muscle. There appears to be little for them at this point. Consuming high quality proteins like our meat, fish, poultry, eggs, which we'll talk about, are already high in BCAAs. So you don't need to specifically buy BCAA supplements to get those amino acids in your diet. Because those foods, like I mentioned, the meat, poultry, dairy, eggs, are already very high percentage foods of BCAAs. So we don't specifically buy BCAAs. There's no research there to show out that they're superior. In fact, the opposite is true. The foods that contain the whole spectrum of amino acids are going to be better choices than just the BCAAs. So it's going to be very important. Consuming essential amino acids is going to be important. We'll talk a little bit more about foods that do contain leucine. Protein is something that's very, very high in leucine. It's a complete protein, digested and absorbed, has a great ability to break down and increase amino acids in the bloodstream. So it's going to be a great food if somebody can include it in terms of meeting their requirements in the diet. So this graph basically shows that for you, that basically after you consume a protein-rich meal, all right, different sources of protein are going to stimulate muscle protein synthesis at different rates. So here you can see whey is superior compared to a soy protein or a casein protein. Okay, so whey and casein come from milk. So if you drink milk, or if you eat cheese, or if you have whey protein, Greek yogurt, regular yogurt, you're going to be getting these sources of protein in the diet. Whey has a superiority in terms of increasing the leucine content in the blood very, very quickly and stimulating that muscle protein synthesis to occur. So if we don't have any issues with whey and dairy, that would be the way to go based on the current research that we have. Although if there are preferences and reasons that we cannot consume these foods, we can definitely work around it. And that's why it's best to meet with a dietitian who can show an athlete what are some other good sources of protein they can use consuming milk or dairy-based foods. So this is a nice little graph that is going to show you quality protein. So protein is classified in different ways. It's classified in the amino acid content. It's classified by its ability, how well it can be utilized. So foods like meat, dairy, and eggs are very high quality proteins. How much protein is in that food, we test and absorb it and use it in an efficient manner. Those the meat, fish, poultry, and eggs contain all 9 essential amino acids by the body, meaning they're essential, meaning that we have to take them in the diet. We cannot synthesize them on our own. So in general, your animal-based proteins are going to be a better source because they are complete and they're more bioavailable. All right, we're actually getting more protein out of those foods than some of the plant-based sources. Okay. In regards to protein and its effect on collagen production, because I've mentioned that a little bit, collagen is that main component of tendons and ligaments. So collagen synthesis does decrease during immobilization, according to the research. As far as amino acids having an effect, the research looking at that in terms of protein in a meal affecting collagen synthesis, showing it does not have a major effect in terms of stimulating collagen synthesis right after a meal. So this basically means protein intakes and specific types of protein are not going to have a huge effect on how much collagen can synthesize. There is new research looking into this. There's actually looking at vitamin C and gelatin as potentially helping synthesizing collagen. Small amount of research, not a whole lot to really go off there in terms of recommendations. But there is a little bit of research looking into that currently to see it's the current research is kind of with populations that are already exercising. If they go out and do a bout of exercise and they do consume vitamin C and gelatin either before or after, it could potentially help increase collagen synthesis after that exercise or after that exercise has occurred. But we don't have anything in terms of injury research for gelatin and vitamin C as it relates to collagen synthesis. Plant-based proteins, so these are all obviously, except for tofu at the bottom, which is made from soy. Your plant-based proteins are not complete proteins. So protein is made up of amino acids, essential amino acids. We need 9 of them. And the unique thing about your animal-based foods is that it contains all 9 of them. Things like nuts and beans and rice and other grains, seeds, peanut butter, all that kind of stuff, that they do contain some protein, but they lack certain essential amino acids. And so you don't get spectrum there. So you have to combine, when you're on a plant-based diet, you need to make sure you're getting a good spectrum of plant-based foods there to make sure you're filling all the gaps in terms of amino acids. And so that's why, I mean, it already kind of makes sense with certain dishes that we prepare. You're getting complementary amino acids at meals. Like if you eat something like red beans and rice, well, beans lack certain amino acids that rice has and vice versa. Okay, so if you combine those two, you're getting a complete protein. Or in another instance, say nuts or peanuts, peanut butter. Peanut butter is not a complete, or peanuts are not complete protein. You combine that though with a piece of bread, you make a complete protein. So that wheat protein and the protein in the legume or peanut, you combine those two together and you're making a complete protein. So that's very, very important in terms of planning out protein needs for a vegetarian athlete or a vegan athlete, making sure that they are getting complementary proteins all throughout the diet. So what would this practically look like? Say, we're trying to increase protein at every meal, making sure we're spreading it out. What does this look like, in a day for somebody? So just very simply, you have 3 meals, 3 snacks, high quality protein, all at each meal, each snack, omelet, 3 eggs, ounce of low fat cheese, 1 ounce of meat wrapped in a whole grain tortilla, right? Very simple, easy breakfast. Snack could simply be a protein bar, doesn't have to be, but that's definitely gonna easily supply 20 grams or so of protein at a snack, very easy to consume. Lunch, you're getting good high quality protein through the turkey. Snack, a smoothie made with whey protein. That could be a post recovery snack if somebody's in the rehab phase. And then dinner, high quality protein included. And then finally a snack, some Greek yogurt at night, which actually has a high amount of what we call casein protein. And casein is digested a little bit, significantly slower than whey protein. So there's some research there that shows that eating casein-rich foods before night might be beneficial because you're getting a slow, steady release of amino acids in the blood overnight while you're not eating, and this could help that muscle protein synthesis to occur over long periods of time versus that short window. So including something like a Greek yogurt and fruit or something at night might not be a bad option for the protein content and the type of protein that we have. Other nutrients to consider. So we've talked about calories, we've talked about protein, but what are maybe some other things that could be beneficial? Okay, so creatine is something that's been looked at. Creatine is a substance that has a lot of evidence for increasing muscle mass and strength. It is one of the most researched supplements out there on the market, and it appears to be safe for almost anybody in terms of populations. The 7-day study looking at providing 20 grams of creatine per day benefit in terms of loss in arms that were immobilized. However, there was another study that I found in a different research paper. It was a 2-week study on lower that showed that the creatine mutation did not reduce any muscle loss in lower limbs. So there could be some differences here in terms of effect, and this could be attributed to legs versus arms, and also time of immobilization could play a role there as well. So we don't really have consensus recommendations, but the option to trial it can be considered. Dosage is not clear. We don't have any dosage recommendations for injury recovery and creatine. But in general, a creatine loading phase starts off with 20 to 25 grams a day for about a week. And that's basically to saturate the muscle with creatine and then going down to 3 to 5 grams per day. Calcium and also vitamin K are very important for bone health. So bones are effective use, like I mentioned. So encouraging those calcium-rich foods. So dairy is very easy in terms of if you have 3 servings of dairy per day, you can pretty much meet your calcium. We don't have increased calcium needs at this point in terms of injury recovery. However, we don't have any increased needs there for calcium, but it wouldn't hurt from a dietary perspective to include more of those calcium-rich foods. If you're going to be not consuming dairy-rich for whatever reason, and you need it to consume it through vegetables, leafy greens, broccoli, other sources, beans, the quantity of those foods are going to have to take a big increase because it's very hard to consume large amounts of calcium within those foods if you're not eating large quantities. And so that goes back to that calorie balance thing. And will eating too many of those foods affect how much protein you're taking? Potentially there. Because a lot of those foods are high in fiber. Vitamin D tends to be consumed in the general public because there's a lack of availability of vitamin D in food. We don't have a lot of foods that are naturally high in vitamin D. And if you're not going outside in the sun, you're not synthesizing enough, that could be problematic. So oral supplement might be warranted here. It'd be best to get some vitamin D labs drawn to see where a person is at and see what their status is to get them to sufficient levels. Nutrients important for wound healing. There's no, in terms of the research, looking at needing to starting to take extra supplements for a vitamin C or zinc, which all play a role in wound healing. We don't need to start high dose supplements. There's no indication there's a need for it. If you're concerned about sufficiency, incorporating specific foods that will help increase nutrients is a way to kind of ensure that. And then also simply taking a multivitamin can help as well. In terms of omega-3 supplementation, I talked about how it's not really important in terms of that inflammation process from injury. There's a lot of ongoing research, though, with it potentially being beneficial for concussions and traumatic brain injuries. But we don't have a consensus from any of those papers that say how much omega-3s to take and how the benefit from those omega-3s in terms of concussions. So you might see recommendations there for that, but based on the body of evidence, at least from what I've looked at, and there could be some other papers out there that I've missed, there wasn't any clear, concise recommendations. As far as will it be detrimental? Likely not, but is it truly providing a big benefit? It's to be determined, and seeing how much we need, how much EPA or DHA, I should say, which is the type of omega-3 fatty acid is needed, is going to be important. There's a lot of details there that we need to figure out before we can specifically recommend a specific dietary supplement for a specific instance. Now, in terms of what to avoid, there's been some research showing that alcohol can impair muscle protein synthesis. So if you're working out, trying to increase lean body mass, consuming a lot of alcohol is not going to be a good idea. It's going to delay that process. And also alcohol can delay wound healing. So limiting or avoiding alcohol during this process is going to be recommended, is going to be the way to go according to, for general health, obviously. But if we're talking about injury recovery, minimizing that as much as possible or avoiding it. So general summary here, what we're looking at, avoiding deficiency in calories is really, really vital. Making sure we're taking in enough protein. Those are kind of the two main keys to enhancing recovery from exercise-induced injuries. Higher protein intakes are generally warranted and will provide benefit for sure. As far as exact amounts, we do not know. We have these ranges, so in terms of how much protein per day to consume, aim for somewhere in that range of 1.6 to 2.5 grams per kilogram of body weight of protein. I kind of said kind of in the middle there at that 2 grams per kilogram as a good starting point. We know that spreading out that intake at least amongst 4 meals is beneficial for maximally stimulating the muscle protein synthesis. And we want to choose high quality proteins. Also making sure that meals and snacks containing leucine rich foods are very helpful for stimulating the muscle protein synthesis. Regarding supplements, though, if we're going to trial out some creatine, if we're going to trial out a multivitamin or something else, we definitely want to make sure it's third-party certified. Looking at a NSF for sport certification, they're going to have the most rigorous rules for supplementation, and they're going to eliminate any chance in terms of containing a banned substance. And then finally, of course, minimizing or avoiding alcohol is warranted here. So these are my references, and that's all I got for you guys today. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Yep. Thanks, Mike. I think what we'll do, a couple of things. One, if you came in late, please fill out the attendance sheet, and that's down in the chat area. I think Tess has sent that out again. If you have any issues, please email Tess. She's going to come on here in a minute. And as far as questions are concerned, if you'll go down to the chat area down at the bottom of the screen and type those questions in, we'll kind of go through. We'll get Mike to review those and give everyone a second to send some questions in. and then we'll bring Tess on for some closing comments if we get to that point. All right, I'm not seeing any. I do want to thank Mike for doing the presentation today, and for everybody joining us today with regard to what we're trying to accomplish here in this time when everyone is having difficulty to get their continuing education. A lot of conferences are being canceled. We're going to try to continue to do some of this, so please make sure that everybody gives us their email address so Tess can include all of that. Tess, any other closing comments?
Yeah, so thank you. I did just put up my contact information, so hopefully everybody can see that. So like Dr. Stewart said, I'm the Director of Education for the Center for Sport. We will be continuing to do these webinars. My cell and my email is listed here. So if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. If for some reason you had an issue with the attendance form, please email me your name and credentials so that I can make sure to get you on the attendance form. I will be sending out statement of credit, of course, evaluations. Everybody will receive one of those so that we can use your feedback on developing upcoming webinars. Obviously, this is a little bit newer for us, and it's all being done very quickly. So we appreciate you working through some of the glitches with us, and we're looking to make each webinar better and better in terms of delivery. Please make sure you complete those attendance sheets. And then upcoming webinars, we have a webinar scheduled for April 14th, Innovative Treatment for Hamstring Strains from Dr. Jacques Coursault, and then a mental health seminar coming up on April 15th that will be presented by one of our licensed clinical social workers, Jill, from the Professional Athlete Care Team. So be on the lookout for that information. And we look forward to hosting you again. I will be, the slides will be available for share. So I think I'm going to send those out through a Dropbox link. So if anybody along the way has any issues accessing them, please just stay in contact with me. All right. And I think that is it. So if we have no further questions, again, thank you to everyone for joining us today. And thanks to Mike for the presentation.